Welcome back. This is lesson 3 of the Beginner Bag Maker Bootcamp. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about different skills and techniques that's going to really elevate your bag making and sewing skills. One of those techniques is called top stitching that we use a lot in bag making and in sewing in general. But there's also edge stitching and under stitching that I don't use very often, but it is a technique that I want to share with you in this lesson. We're also going to talk about interfacing. When it comes to interfacing, it can get a little bulky when adding different layers on the back sides of your fabric. So we're going to talk about how to minimize some of that bulk and just how to fuse it in general. So let's jump into some of these skills and techniques that's going to continue to help you make a professional looking bag. So some of the interfacing that we looked at have synthetic material, and synthetic material will melt if it's got too much heat on it. So what you want to do is make sure that you have a pressing cloth that we talked about in the last lesson to just make sure that none of the residue from the interfacing is going to get onto your iron, because that could definitely affect the outcome of your project. So here's a tip for you. If your interfacing does not stick to your fabric after about 5 or 6 seconds or so, then you want to increase the heat on your iron, because lightweight interfacings will bubble or start to puckle up a little bit if there is too much heat on the iron. So more heavyweight interfacing will take a longer time to fuse to the backside of the fabric. So more like around 5 to 10 seconds. You want to hold the iron onto the pressing cloth a little bit longer, and you might even need to press just a little bit harder to make sure that it fuses onto the backsides of the fabric. And you never want to fuse more than one layer at a time. So if you are adding multiple layers of interfacing to the backsides of the fabric, just make sure that the first layer is fused completely before adding another layer. So my favorite type of backing is fusible fleece, but you want to make sure you use steam with the fusible fleece to make sure that it adheres. You don't really need a whole lot of pressure. You just need a good bit of steam or a damp pressing cloth. Now let's talk about your fabric when it comes to adding the fusible fleece on the bag. Now before I start any bag making project, I like to make sure that my fabric is pressed really well. And when you're working with different bag patterns, you cut out all the pieces usually first. There's a technique called block fusing where you fuse all of the fusible fleece onto the back sides of the fabric before you cut out the pattern pieces. I don't really use this technique a whole lot, because then you have to remove the fusible fleece from the back sides of the fabric along the seam. Well, I usually cut out all of my fabric pieces, my pattern pieces, and then I'll just fuse them onto the fusible fleece, which I tend to cut just a little bit smaller all the way around, about an inch, to leave it out of the seam when I'm sewing. So adding fusible fleece is great for adding structure and giving your bag a shape, but there are some places where you really don't want the fusible fleece or your interfacing to be. Before making some projects, you can cut some of your fusible fleece pieces without the seam allowance. It is a little harder to cut the interfacing away from the seam after the piece is already sewn. So I like to just make sure that when I'm cutting out my interfacing, it is about an inch smaller all the way around on the pattern piece, because that eliminates me having to go remove the fusible fleece or interfacing from the seam. So a lot of times in a lot of my patterns, I just make sure that when I'm adding any type of backing to the fabric, that it is about an inch all the way around smaller on the back sides of the fabric. And that's just going to make sure it's completely out of the seam when you're sewing. And pressing your seams open is definitely going to make sure that the bulk is evenly distributed throughout the entire bag, and it's going to really give your bag a nice flat and professional look. So another way to reduce the bulk when it comes to sewing your seams, I usually cut off about 1/4 of an inch or at least half of the excess seam. And when sewing bag layers together, when you turn the bag inside out, some of the corners can be kind of bulky. To reduce some of the bulk in the corners, what I'll do is just cut on a slant right towards the corners. And that usually helps a lot. In bag making, there's a lot of visible stitches. So you want to make sure any stitch that you can see looks very neat and clean. So when you start stitching, you want to make sure that the thread is hanging in the back of the presser foot. Usually I try to hold it a little bit so that way the thread doesn't slip through the needle, and then you have to rethread the needle. Lock in the stitches by starting the stitch a few stitches and then going back a few in reverse and then going forward again, and that's just going to make sure that your stitches are locked in and they won't come out. And then after you stitch a piece, I like to use my thread snips and just cut the thread and throw it in my little thread catcher, which is just a little trash can. But you can leave some of the stitching that's on the underside. If there is a piece of thread that's still hanging off, If it's not going to be shown, you can leave it inside of the bag or leave it there. Let's get into different types of stitching. So top stitching is usually visible stitches that are sewn over the fabric. Really a technique that you use a lot because you attach pockets. Straps are done with top stitching, and they can be decorative. So if you have a lot of different stitch patterns on your machine, you might want to go ahead and test out some of them. There is a lot of top stitching around the vertical seams of bags and flaps. So this part of the bag, you really get to see a lot of the stitching, and you really want your stitching to be nice and neat with straight lines and just look really nice. So let's take a look at top stitching and what it actually looks like. This is some of the top stitching that I'm doing for some of the bags I sell on Etsy. This is a little pumpkin purse I made a while ago. It turned out really cute, but I was using the top stitching technique to create the lines that are going to be on the front of the pumpkin to make it look like a real pumpkin. So even though these lines are kind of decorative, they are functional because it's going to hold all the layers together with the batting on the inside to make the quilting look of the pumpkins. This is just one example of top stitching, but you use it in so many other ways. So there's another technique called edge stitching. And with edge stitching, you're just sewing really close to the seam. So it's just like top stitching, except you're going to sew between 1/16 and 1/8 from the seam. So let's take a look at edge stitching and how you apply it to a bag. Using the edge stitching technique to attach the zipper onto the fabric. So as you can see, I'm using a zipper foot and I'm really close to the fold line to just really get close to the edge. I used a little bit of edge stitching to create the strap on this denim tote bag. So right near the seam where I folded the fabric over, I'm sewing really close to the seam just so that way I can attach the fabric on right in that area and just hold the layers together. But then it turned into the strap after I got past a certain point. So there's so many other parts of the bag where you may have to use edge stitching, but right here along this edge where I created the strap, I really wanted to go slow because these stitches are visible and I wanted them to look very neat. And then lastly, there's understitching. If you want to sew underneath the seam or on the other side of the seam, understitching is also a great way to just keep the seam in place. So bags that have a facing, you really use a little bit of understitching to help the facing hold in place. And if there's any fabric that has to fold over the top edge of the bag, using a little bit of understitching is going to hold all of those layers together really nice and neat. So you normally sew about 1/16 away from the seam when you're understitching, but it's going to make everything nice and flat on top of the bag, and it's going to make really crisp and clean lines. So for example, if we pretend this is the top rim of a bag and this is just two layers together, the outer layer and the lining layer, I folded the seam over to the lining side after sewing both layers together. And then I'm just going to place it back underneath the presser foot. And then I'm just going to sew really close to the seam, about 1/8 or 1/16 away from the seam, or 2 millimeters. So I am using our edge stitching technique to create the understitch by stitching really close to the seam. So now the seam in the back is attached to the lining side. So when I fold the two layers together, you don't see any of the stitching on the front of the bag. And it just makes a nice, crisp, clean line. And it really gives it a professional look. So this is the stitching on the underside. You don't see any stitching on the other side. All right, so we made it through a lot of information. Lesson 3 was packed with a lot of information about different stitches, how to use the interfacing. So now I think in lesson 4, it's time to use some of these skills and techniques to apply it to your very first bag. It's going to be a very simple and easy pattern, but I think you're ready. So let's get right into lesson 4.